In this lesson, we're going to talk about the deformation loops that we'll need in a character. Alright, so looking at the reference image for our character, it could be very easy to get wrapped up in the details in the character itself. And without properly setting up the deformation loops of a character, those details really won't matter. Now, whenever we talk about deformation, we're talking about animation of a character. So this means that later on this character could be rigged, so using bones and controls to animate this character to put into a film. Okay, you could even build this character to even put it in a game if you like. We would have some different modeling restrictions to go by in that case, but either way, you need to make sure that you have the character properly built in order for the animator to do that. So now we're getting into a phase of we're working to help somebody else down in the pipeline. So whenever we are modeling a character, there are some particular areas that we need to pay attention to. First off, in the body itself. Let's just take a look at the torso. You need to make sure that your character can deform in a couple of different ways. First off, the character should be able to rotate back and forth at the pivot of the hip itself. So the pivot, or the hip, would stay stationary, but then the abdomen and the chest would follow through, going back and forth. Now, most of that flexibility is going to be right here underneath the breastplate. Okay, so you're looking at the abdomen with most of these loops. Now, whenever we start talking about the torso, we need to remember that this is the central hub for all of the limbs. So the arms, whenever they move, they are going to have some influence over the chest. So whenever we start moving into that section, we'll talk about how those are affected. Now, moving into the hips themselves, this is extremely important because here, this is where the global control is going to be held. The hips themselves are going to be the stationary or the anchor pivot for this object. So the legs are going to move, okay, in multiple directions. And we need to make sure that we build the hips in such a way that they have enough loops to allow for that deformation. So looking at the legs themselves, we're going to need loops that come across the thigh and then across the hip. Okay. Now, as we go down into the leg, we're going to get more and more loops, and then we're going to get down into the knee. Now, this is a major area where the leg is going to bend, so we're going to need enough segments in the knee for that to happen, for that to deform properly. Same thing with the ankles. Okay, we're going to need those. And then any pivot point in the feet themselves. So along the top knuckles of the toes down into the toe phalanges themselves. So looking at this in the torso, okay, we need to remember that we need loops coming across the abdomen because that is the most flexible. Coming across the hip, you're going to need some loops coming across the top, but then more often than not, you're going to need loops that come right across the midsection of the hip itself, down, separating out the legs. So from here, we're going to talk about the arms. Now, earlier we had said that the arms are going to be coming into the chest, and whenever those move, they're going to deform the body in such a way. So whenever the arm is deforming in animation, it can go in almost any direction. Now, there are some restriction on the angles, but whenever you start thinking about characters for animations in film, you really shouldn't put restrictions on your animator. So you need to make sure that you have enough segments in any area that's going to deform to give that animator as much flexibility as possible. So don't think of real-world restrictions whenever you're moving your limbs, especially in the arms and legs. So now, what loops do we need in this particular character? Well, whenever the shoulders are moving, they actually move in a very diverse way. If you were going to shrug, you're going to have your shoulders coming up, and that's going to affect everything in this area, in the chest itself. So whenever you pull that shoulder control up to have the character shrug or something like that, those loops need to be there across the chest that will affect that area. Also, whenever the character raises their arm straight out. So if you were to take the wrist and you were to lift it up here, it would look like the character's in a T-pose. So if we're moving in that direction, you're going to need enough segments here across the top of the shoulder to deform and actually pinch where your skin is folding in together at this point right here. Also, you're going to need segments going across into the chest. Okay, so it's kind of like building out a cape, if you will. So if you kind of create a line that's coming off of the neck, and then if you take those segments and you go from the middle of the chest outward toward the shoulders, okay, it's kind of like a cape, if you will. And then from the chest, we'll actually have segments that actually come up and around the shoulder itself, and that just allows for the maximum amount of deformation in a character. So now that we've talked about the shoulders, let's talk about the elbows themselves. The elbows are going to be very similar to the knees, so we're going to need enough segments in the elbows to allow for that deformation to happen, and same thing with the wrist. Now, more importantly, well, I wouldn't necessarily say more importantly, but it's often overlooked, is the knuckles themselves. The knuckles for the fingers will go straight out, and you can have a little bit of bend in this direction. But most of the bending, let's say that the character is going to be making a fist, is going to be right on the knuckles themselves. So we need to make sure that we have enough geometry there for that deformation to happen. Now moving on from here, we're going to need the neck. Now the neck is just going to be loops that go all the way across, and usually the neck is a pretty easy area. The most problem that we'll have out of the neck is just trying to connect the head to that body. Now that brings us to the last portion here, which is the head itself. And in the face, there are so many loops in the face to allow for perfect articulation of emotion in a character. We need to make sure that we take care of the loops that are naturally in the face. So for example, the character's mouth is going to have lots and lots of loops that go around the lips. Okay, we'll still create those forms, but we'll have lots of loops, and they're going to get very tight together, that will go around that mouth and will allow the character's mouth to open really wide if necessary, okay, and will allow it to articulate, to create words. Now those loops will tend to go around the mouth, and then we'll actually get a loop that connects to those mouth loops that comes up from over the top of the nose. So it kind of looks like we're creating a mask around the character's face. So it would initially kind of look like a ninja mask, if you want to think of it that way. Now from there we have the eyes. The eyes are going to have loops that go all the way around, and they're going to build into the nose, and they'll actually go across, and they'll connect in that way. Then those loops will connect into the cheek, okay, which will build out in multiple directions to allow for smile lines and things like that in a character. Now the eyes will also come up into the brow. And the brow is also something that gets forgotten because we need to create furrows to where a character were to frown or to have a concerned look. They usually have some sort of line in between the brow to show that off. So we need to make sure that we have those segments available there. Now then we start going up into the skull and into the ears, and that's where the loops will have to ultimately terminate from the face itself. So whenever you're building the head, make sure that you have the articulation of the face clear before you start building out anything else in the head itself. So now that we've talked about all of the different parts of the body and what needs to articulate, now we're ready to actually get in and start putting that to practice. So we're going to start out with the body, and we're going to start building out some of those important loops using those polygon or edge extrusion modeling techniques. So I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the deformation loops that we'll need in a character. Alright, so looking at the reference image for our character, it could be very easy to get wrapped up in the details in the character itself. And without properly setting up the deformation loops of a character, those details really won't matter. Now, whenever we talk about deformation, we're talking about animation of a character. So this means that later on this character could be rigged, so using bones and controls to animate this character to put into a film. Okay, you could even build this character to even put it in a game if you like. We would have some different modeling restrictions to go by in that case, but either way, you need to make sure that you have the character properly built in order for the animator to to do that. So now we're getting into a phase of we're working to help somebody else down in the pipeline. So whenever we are modeling a character,